Of CBSN contributor Isaac Stonefish joining me now. He's a senior fellow at the Asia Society Center on U.S.-China relations. Isaac, I feel like we were not here all that long ago talking about this very same prospect. Of course, it was a big deal the very first time President Trump met with Kim Jong Un. I remember watching that. Now, though, the question is, what exactly is the objective during this one? As we just heard Christina lay out in very specific detail, there's not really any clear objective right now. There's not really even a schedule, and it's a very unusual kind of atmosphere to be heading into a summit of this magnitude without even word of whether it's going to take 1 day, 2 days, all those basics yet.
It is. It's still a really big deal because North Korea is still such a foreign presence to the rest of the world. We still know so little about it, and the fact that the two men are meeting is still quite significant. I agree completely, though, that we are really just sort of watching and trying to grope for any sort of sense of what's going to happen over these next few days. I mean, it's really astounding how little we know about what the two men are going to do.
I mean, so what we do know is that the Trump administration declared North Korea was on board with what he called total denuclearization. But then last week, the president said that he's in, quote, no rush to see that happen. It would seem to be a bit of a mixed message there.
I think it is, and I think the president is smart moving towards the latter message about not being in any rush, because I think we can frankly say there's zero chance that North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons anytime in the foreseeable future. Bit of a wiggle phrase, the future is never foreseeable, but we cannot expect them to do that. There's so many reasons for them to keep it. And so if Trump moves the goalposts so that we're now trying to improve relations with North Korea and not expecting them to give up their nuclear weapons, I think that's much more realistic.
Well, is there anything that could essentially stall these talks? Any kind of demand that would be, too outrageous so that these talks would end completely?
That's a really good question. I think the two men, Trump especially, have staked so much on continuing these talks that almost regardless of what Kim Jong Un says privately, the talks will go on. I think if he says something really outrageous publicly, there's certainly a possibility that the talks will derail. If they test a nuclear weapon or a missile right after the end of the talks, that would be really difficult for the Trump administration to continue business as usual. But I think outside of that, the talks will go on, and we'll keep seeing a very slow march of progress. I mean, it really was remarkable when these two leaders met for the very first time. I remember watching it thinking, this is not something that we have ever seen before. An American president actually shaking the hand of a North Korean leader. I'm wondering, do you think this issue of North Korea will actually help define, when it comes to foreign policy, President Trump's time in office and his legacy in office? That was indeed a historic moment. I think the Nixon parallel is a good one. So Nixon is remembered both for opening up to China and also for the massive scandals that ended up burying him. And it's way too early to tell what Trump's historic domestic legacy is going to be, but it is certainly possible that he has that counterpart too with what happens domestically and by bringing North Korea back into the international system.
So it was interesting. On Sunday, the president delayed the deadline for the U.S. and China to reach a trade agreement. How might those tensions come into play, you think, during this summit? Could they?
They certainly could, and I think it was probably smart to not be, I want to say fighting a war on two fronts, but to not be dealing with both of these issues at the same time and focusing this week on North Korea, and then after this is done, getting back into issues with China. Certainly China is involved quietly with the summit preparations and is certainly talking to the North Koreans and presumably to the Americans as well about what's the best way to put this forward and to make sure that the North Korean side doesn't do anything that the Chinese don't really want them to do.
And what about the venue here for this summit? Christina talked about it a little bit, but what's the symbolism here behind choosing to hold this in Vietnam?
There's a lot of symbolism with Vietnam. It has economically liberalized while remaining politically quite repressive, which is what North Korea wants. It's also been able to, after fighting wars with both the United States and China in the 1970s, to maintain decent relations with them both. And countries like Vietnam, which border China, just like North Korea does, they want to make sure to not be too deep into China's economic and political orbit. So that's also a message for North Korea, which fears being too reliant on China.
Yeah, it's worth noting that those relations between the U.S. and Vietnam were greatly improved with the help of the late Senator John McCain. So it'll be interesting to see if the president makes any mention of that. All right.
Doubt it.
Doubt it. All right. Isaac Stonefish. Isaac, thanks so much.
Thank you.